Hello, my name is Joel Austin, and welcome to Beyond the Walled Garden. This podcast focuses on alternative perspectives to modernity to help us all arrive at more generative, interesting, dynamic, healthy places. Neurodivergence is a topic that has certainly been making its way into the cultural zeitgeist for the last decade or so. And as someone who's done years of therapy, various types of therapy at various points in my life, I've definitely been curious to learn more about it. Today's guest, though, has something to offer on top of her understanding of neurodivergence. We're also talking about trauma therapy and liberation and how these three things intersect. I am talking today with Sara Eldridge. Sara is a licensed clinical social worker based in New York City, where she provides clinical supervision and trauma therapy. She specializes in working with members of the LGBTQIA+ community, autistic individuals, and people with ADHD. As both a therapist and supervisor, she centers the intersections of oppressive systems, neurodiversity, individual trauma, and mental health systems. When she's not working, she is an avid reader, and you are definitely going to hear some of her recommendations for books on this episode: musical theater devotee, vegetarian chef, and fitness enthusiast. If you are considering therapy or someone who's working through trauma or considering working through trauma, this is definitely going to be an episode you're going to want to check out. So thank you so much for coming on the show today. Something that jumped out to me, I think this is probably going to be like the framing of our entire conversation, is you say that in your therapeutic practice and in your life, you really have like these sort of tentpole areas, which are neurodiversity, trauma theory, and liberation. And you're concerned with the intersection of these things. I think a good way to just like give the audience a framework for what we're going to be talking about today would be to just break down each of those so that we can kind of figure out what that intersection is. So let's start with neurodiversity. Can you just give me a general overview of how you would define neurodiversity, how you think about it, how it works in your practice?
Yeah, absolutely. So neurodiversity, the concept was first developed, I want to say back in the 90s, and it was first developed to speak about autism and has since brought in to talk about things like ADHD, other mental health conditions, schizophrenia, bipolar, all kinds of different conditions. And the concept of neurodiversity is like any other kind of diversity, right? That there are natural variations in the way that the human brain works. And instead of focusing so much on comparing those differences to some stereotypical, normal, healthy brain, which isn't really real, right? Everyone has things that they struggle with or find difficult or challenging. That instead we look at these diversities, these differences as natural variations in humanity, and how can we better accommodate these differences, right? Instead of trying to force people to conform or behave or think in one really particular narrow way. Now, of course, right, if someone's behavior or thought patterns or emotions are really distressing to them or to others, or is posing like a harm or a risk to others, we're not saying that like, that's totally fine. Like, just go out there, run wild, hurt yourself. Like, obviously we want to provide intervention and support for that. But we're also saying that for someone who, for example, I have ADHD, the fact that I might have a really hard time sitting down, and I did have a hard time sitting down in a classroom for like 8 hours straight, right? Paying attention, just like locked in. Then instead of seeing that as a problem that had to be cured, then maybe we could be creative and be like, well, what do kids like this need to be engaged in school, right? Maybe we need to have more opportunities to like get up and like move around and like do group projects, et cetera, instead of saying like, oh, you're wrong, we need to fix you, right? So that's kind of broadly how I think of neurodiversity, that it's less about what's wrong with you and more how can we help you and the world adapt to be more accommodating.
Gotcha. So is harm sort of the line where you start to say, okay, this is extending beyond like just something you're learning to integrate in yourself and live with, and this is into territory where it's something we need to treat? Is it like self-harm and harming other people? Is that sort of the line?
Yeah, I would say certainly self-harm and harming others. We do see with kids, some kids who have like autism and other sort of like developmental disabilities, unfortunately, can find it really hard to control and manage their own like behaviors and their own responses. And even if it's not coming from a place of like malice, you know, they might be the kind of kid that you see like they throw toys at other people, or maybe they hit themselves or they hit someone else. That's certainly something that we want to think about. Okay, how can we manage that, right? How can we help that, keep that from happening? Maybe it's medication, maybe it's some kind of like behavioral therapy, right? There's other supports they might need. But yes, also when we think about like self-harm, self-injury, suicidality, right? I'm certainly not coming from a place of policing folks' behavior. So I'm not really, in my work, when clients come and we talk about suicidality, self-harm, first step is going to be to normalize that. It's really common. A lot of people experience these behaviors or these thoughts and feelings. And if someone's in an immediate risk to themselves, right? Like I'm really worried that when they leave the session that they're really going to hurt themselves, then we might have to have a conversation of like, hey, I really think that you might need to go to the hospital, or like, do you have a friend or someone who can come over and sit with you? I'd really ideally not like to get, like the police or the authorities involved, because a lot of times that just escalates the situation. But yeah, absolutely. Harm is certainly a criteria that we use. And also I think harm is something that people decide for themselves as well, right? So a lot of times with the work that I'm doing, I might have my own thoughts and feelings about what it means to like lead a healthy life or have healthy relationships or whatever. And I can provide some education based on my own experience and training. But at the end of the day, like it's a client's decision, right? If I am like, your job sounds terrible, it's really stressful, you clearly hate it, it's driving you crazy, but they're like, nope, I really need to stay at this job. You got to help me figure out how to stay at this job. Like, okay, I think it's harmful, but you're telling me that it's not, or that you're willing to put up with that harm, right? So you're ultimately the expert in your own life, and my job is just to kind of support you in that.
That's such a good point. I mean, I think about my own experience with therapy and the times in which I was clearly engaging in behaviors that were harmful, and my therapist was just like, okay, let's figure out a way for you to deal with internally how to manage that. Mm-hmm. It's a really good point. Have you seen people be kind of like liberated by adopting this sort of neurodivergent framework?
Yes, although I will say it's also very challenging, because I work with adults. And so a lot of the folks I work with are people who are late diagnosed with autism or ADHD, right? So it's not until they were adults themselves. Similarly, I didn't really even consider ADHD until I was in my 30s. I'm 39 now. And so I didn't get diagnosed until 3 or 4 years ago. And so while I do think it is a liberated or a liberatory perspective, there's so much shame and guilt and self-blame that a lot of folks have developed over the years of trying to fit in, of trying to conform, of feeling like, well, everybody else can do it, so how come I can't? How come I struggle with like getting things done on time? Or how come I get really easily overwhelmed when I'm in a crowded setting? Or like other people, can go on vacation and like I find it stressful. Like all these little things where folks are comparing themselves. And so there's a lot of work, I think, to be done of sort of normalizing that and disentangling that and saying like, that's not a failure on your part, right? It's a figuring out of like, there's certain things that need to change about the way that you move through the world maybe, or that type of job you have or whatever. But that's where it's really hard, right? Because we've all just like, so especially, I can only speak for like American culture and society because that's where I'm from and where I've spent my life. But American culture and society certainly really praises like the hard worker, the independent person who doesn't really need other people's help, who isn't lazy, who's like always hustling, and someone who's like, I can't do that, right? That like 40 hours a week is like really hard to work, and that maybe I actually do need support of like family or partners. And it really is hard to like live on my own and like cook for myself and do my chores and go to work, and like I'm struggling, right? we see that as something wrong with me versus like, this is just a cultural message that we're getting, right? And that maybe that's a problem to assume that that's the ideal, right? So it's a lot of like having to tease that apart for folks.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, ideal is such a powerful word in that thought because it's, you know, all of this sort of like trying to normalize your behavior into some sort of pattern. There's an implicit sort of undertone to that, which is that there is an ideal that we should all be trying to strive toward. And what I'm hearing you say is that the only real ideal is diversity, that we all are in our own sort of biological and behavioral patterns. And the best we can possibly do is learn how to deal with those as we're handed them in terms of our biology, our circumstances, our life experiences. Is that a pretty fair sort of statement?
Yeah, absolutely. I would totally agree with that, you know? And I think also we have to keep in mind that like ideal varies so much across like time and culture and society and religion. And what's the ideal for people in 2025 in America is like kind of new, right? Even in our society, right? So I think that also helps us to remember that these things are always changing. It's not fixed, which I think is great because it means that we have that freedom to decide for ourselves, right? What is the ideal for ourselves? Because there is no absolute.
Yeah. I mean, this word seems to find its way into every episode I record, so maybe it's just something I need to work through. But the thing I keep, finding myself circling around is where the ideal comes from, it seems to me, is connected to meaning. What matters to you? What do you sort of implicitly gravitate toward? Or do you help people in your practice sort of discover meaning, drill down on meaning, and try to understand it? And if so, what does that process look like?
That's such a great question. I love that because, I think that's so important. Last year I did this training on working with neurodivergence, and the trainer spoke about this idea and used the concepts of values, which is, I think very similar to meaning. And so one assignment or whatever that she would give her clients is to have them do like a values assessment, right? And so sometimes I've sent that to folks. Like there's a bunch of online ones that you can find. But I think figuring out for yourself, like whether it's through doing a formal assessment or just through our conversations and me sort of picking up on what are the patterns, what am I hearing you say that's really important to you, and helping folks focus on like what gives your life meaning, right? Again, like a lot of times we are supposed to find meaning in our jobs and like getting married and having kids, and for various reasons that doesn't always work out, or maybe we're like, I just work to pay the bills, but it doesn't give me meaning. Okay, so then what does? Like, what are the things that are really important to you? What really do you value in your life? And I think that is also that's a lot of a process, a lot of work for folks, because again, like I think a lot of times meaning is given to us by our families and our society and our school and maybe our faith. And so it's a lot of work to kind of get in touch with yourself and say like, oh, maybe that's not true, right? Maybe there's other things that I value and that's okay, right? That's another piece that's so hard for folks is like, my values, again, as long as they're not hurting anyone, right? As long as it's not about, which I haven't encountered, right? People's values are mostly things like friends and family and like adventure and like learning new things. Like these are the things people want, right? And if we can connect to that, okay, so then we can figure out like, how do we make that happen in our lives, right? Whether that is through our jobs or the things we do outside of our jobs, our partnerships, whatever. But I think that is I think that's so important. And I really love when I have that opportunity to do that with clients, because then it's not, we're just focusing on like how to help you like cope with the day to day, but how do you find a life that really has meaning for you and that you feel good about, ideally.
Yeah. And, the one thing that has been definitely a journey for me, has been sort of like examining who benefits from the meaning you've adopted. Like that question is it has been for me a really good orienting question. It's like, because it helps me kind of understand where that value came from, if I start probing something that I hold as like a value that's orienting my life, and I probe it, really asking who benefits from it. If the answer is like, you brought up like hustle culture. I think that's a good one, right? Because who benefits from that really at the end of the day? For some people, it's definitely them, but for other people, it's not. It's whatever class you're paying for. The person who's doing that class is the one who's benefiting. And there's all sort of like messaging we do to ourselves to be okay with that. But process is such a good word to bring up in that context. It is a long process. And I was thinking, as we're talking about neurodiversity, I have noticed, tell me if I'm off base here, but I've noticed that the concept of neurodiversity is sort of like, it seems like it's getting roped into a sort of like set of things that are kind of like seen culturally as weak, or there's some sort of like, badness, some sort of like softness to the idea of neurodiversity. I'm thinking of words like, sort of like SJWs, snowflakey, like the people who those words are like a part of their vernacular in terms of how they're quartering and categorizing the world. It seems like the concept of neurodiversity is getting lumped in with that. Is that something you've seen as well?
I have seen that to an extent, and I think unfortunately that's true of because I think neurodiversity, what it's doing is that it's pushing back and it's challenging a lot of stereotypes, a lot of ideas, particularly, when we think about, let's say, capitalism, for example, right? A lot of folks who first of all, I can say a lot about capitalism, but if we think about for folks who are, let's say autistic, ADHD, have some kind of mental health issue, some difference, dyslexia could be a neurodiversity, we tend to, assign value to people based on their productivity in a capitalist society, right? And what a lot of folks who are neurodivergent experience is that they really struggle to be productive at that level, right? At the level that we are demanding of that like 40-hour, 50-hour, 60-hour work week, right? And so if you're saying like, okay, maybe that's not good for me. Like I can't do that. I'm gonna really like burn out my mind and my body, and I don't want to work that hard. I can't work that hard. And like I need to take a step back. I need to deprioritize work. I'm gonna like assert that my value is not in my productivity, but it's in like the type of person that I am and the relationships I have and all of that kind of stuff. Well, that's a big challenge to our society, right? And yeah, we see that as like, well, you're just weak, you're lazy, you're not trying to like fix yourself, you're not trying to conform. But why should you? Who decided that this is the system that is best for all of us, right? To your point about kind of who is benefiting from these values, well, the reality is it's not really the workers who are benefiting from this, right? The majority of the time, it's folks at the top. Even if you're hustling, most of the time, like genuinely, are you hustling so that you can become a millionaire, or are you hustling so that you can make a living wage and you need like 2 or 3 jobs in order to do that, right? That's what often is the case for a lot of people. Or they're hustling because, they want to be an artist, but they have to work a day job, right? To pay the bills, and then they can do art on the side, right? Like, yeah, you're working really hard, but like you're not making that much. You're not really getting the benefit, right? And so I think that's perhaps part of the reason that we see neurodivergence like lumped in with these other things, right? Because it's you're weak, you're lazy, you're all these you're weird, right? Mm-hmm. Things that are not seen as acceptable.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And I think your point too about it being a challenge, it is challenging to just say that everyone is different. And the best we can do is learn to live with our differences in ourselves and celebrate our differences. That is a really big challenge to a system that's hierarchically organized to predispose certain ways of being over others. like capitalism and others. I am going to get right back to the episode with Sara Eldridge, but before I do, I want to tell you about a very exciting project that I've got going on right now. It is called 15 to Sunrise, and it is pretty relevant to today's conversation. 15 to Sunrise follows a young woman named Ruby Capps, who is dealing with the recent death of her mother, who was a particularly emotionally abusive parent in her life. Not knowing how to deal with the passing of this figure in her life, our protagonist descends into a world of self-harm behaviors. We're talking drug use, alcohol use, sex, hang out with people she shouldn't be hanging out with, predatory people, all this sort of stuff. And in doing so, she unwittingly becomes part of a horrific story involving a set of otherworldly vampires who are dwelling in the tunnels beneath her favorite bar. I have been working on 15 to Sunrise for the last few years with a really incredible group of people, some of whom are longtime collaborators, many of whom are first-time collaborators, and I'm really excited to bring 15 to Sunrise to the world. Now, we are finishing everything up with the film right now, and it should be seeing the light of day in the near future, but if you are interested in learning more about 15 to Sunrise, I've included a link in the description where you can sign up to be notified as soon as we release more information about this film. And if you decide to follow that, I really appreciate you. Without further ado, back to the interview. Okay, so neurodiversity. I think we've got a pretty good framework for what that means. Let's talk now about trauma theory and how you work with trauma. Can you give me just a brief overview of what you mean when you're talking about trauma?
Yeah. So when I think about trauma, I think about trauma, I kind of think of as any experience we have that really overwhelms our ability to cope, right? And so that can be, for a lot of us, we think of, big T traumas like a car accident or some kind of assault or something like that. And those absolutely can be really traumatic. They can really overwhelm us. But I also think about kids, right? Because even though I work with adults, a lot of our traumas happen when we're young because a parent who is, let's say, emotionally like neglectful or abusive, even if you have a roof over your head, they don't hit you, you have food and clothing and all of that, but they are emotionally harming you, you can't cope with that when you're 6 years old. What are you going to do with that, right? You're scared and confused and you don't know what's happening. And so that's kind of broadly how I conceptualize trauma, right? And it impacts us mentally and physically and emotionally. And then what determines if something is traumatic is really how we respond, right? And how we are able to manage that wound, that injury, right? So again, we think about something like a car accident, which can be very traumatic. But if you are someone who has a lot of resources, you have a lot of support, maybe like the emergency services shows up right away, maybe you're not severely injured, you get insurance, and like everything kind of like works out the way that it's supposed to afterwards, it might be like, yeah, that was a shitty thing that happened to me. Like, I'm not glad, but like after maybe a few months, a year, you're able to like move on with your life. You don't really worry about it too much. You get back into a car, etc. Right? Same situation, but someone whose life is in a much worse situation. They don't have the money maybe to take care of their bills. They don't have the support of people in their life. Maybe they're already dealing with some kind of mental health issue. That same car accident might feel really traumatizing, and it might be years before they can get back into a car, right? So it's also really context dependent, person dependent. And I think that's really important to think about too, because sometimes we have this tendency maybe to like compare trauma, right? Well, this one's worse than that one. It's not. It's really just about how you as the person experience it and then how you deal with it and cope with it moving forward. So that's kind of like the framework that I'm using when I think about it.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's great because I even think like, we compare traumas within ourselves. It's like, oh, yeah. Why am I struggling to deal with this thing when I've been through this other thing that was so much worse, and like diminishing what you're going through by comparing it to things you've gone through. It's such a weird game we play with ourselves. So what is the process of working through that trauma look like for you?
Yeah, great question. So the sort of general overarching approach I take draws from, so Judith Herman is she's still alive. She's a psychologist. She wrote this book, Trauma and Recovery, and came up with this sort of like 3-stage model, right? Which is we start with sort of reestablishing safety, right? So helping people feel safe in their environment, but also helping people feel safe in themselves and in their bodies, right? Because a lot of times that's where trauma happens. And so working on like regulation skills and like, deep breathing and grounding. If somebody's in a, dangerous situation, I spent many years working with domestic violence survivors. So like helping them get out of that, because we can't heal from a trauma if we're still in the trauma, right? So helping us get to safety, number one, right? So once we're feeling like relatively safe, the next step is sort of that processing of the trauma. So trying to make sense of what happened to us and how it's impacting us today, but also being able to let go of that sort of like guilt and blame that we often carry around for ourselves, and shame for the things that have happened, right? We got to let go of some of that, because a lot of times we walk around feeling like this is my fault. I can never forgive myself. Like I'm a terrible person, right? And you can't heal if you're walking around saying that shit to yourself all the time, right? Mm-hmm. But it's also letting go of, when I take a trauma-informed, a trauma approach, when I'm looking at folks' behaviors, emotions, responses, I'm always looking at it as a survival strategy, right? So if I encounter someone and the way that they tend to respond to things is they get really angry really fast, right? A lot of times what happens, you find out, is maybe they grew up in a really chaotic household environment or like a chaotic community environment, right? Where there was a lot of danger. And so getting angry was like a survival strategy, right? It was a way to like fight back, lash out, protect themselves from whatever was happening, right? So totally makes sense in that context. Isn't so helpful now that you're an adult and you're trying to like have a job and like have healthy relationships, right? So instead of coming from a place of like, wow, you're a bad person and you need to stop that, it's okay, can we understand where that behavior came from, why it was serving you, and then how do you want to handle this moving forward, right? Like, we're still going to get angry about stuff, right? We all get angry, but instead of lashing out, how do we maybe want to communicate that, right? Like, hey, like it kind of upset me or it hurt me when you said that, instead of screaming at someone, for example, right? And then sort of the last stage, and again, I think it's important to say, like, this is a concept, like, therapy and life doesn't really move through stages like this. The last stage is sort of like, okay, how do we connect to like others and like our community and like form new and healthy relationships, right? And a lot of times those things are happening simultaneously, right? So folks will be in therapy and they're working through stuff, and maybe they start dating someone and that brings up new issues. But if it's a healthy relationship, that can be healing in its own as you're making those connections at the same time as you're processing maybe what happened to you 15, 20 years ago, right? So I think it's like all these things are happening kind of simultaneously, but generally there's sort of a shift from feeling really shut down, really scared, to feeling more safe, making sense of what happened to you, putting some of that stuff in the past, and then feeling like you can connect with others, have healthy relationships, be more, hopefully more positive, more optimistic about the future. So that's kind of the ways that we approach it. And a lot of that is, learning to make peace with yourself, right? Learning to make peace with your experiences, learning to reconnect with your body and your own experiences and sensations. And it's hard, it can be really hard work, but it can be really rewarding too when you learn that you have more agency and more control now than you realized.
Yeah. I've definitely experienced a bit of that. Do you advise people, when you get to the sort of like figuring out how to, interface with other people stage of this,
right,
do you advise people to share their traumas with people they're close with as sort of a way to kind of like express why they may need grace or leeway in certain areas? Like if they are, to use your example, quick-tempered as a response to something that happened in their development, is it generally like something you would advise to say to, your partner, for instance, hey, I'm working through this, I'm realizing this is a thing I've got to work through, I can't just, flip a light switch, but I know, and I'm working on it, and sometimes I'm going to mess up. Like, is that the kind of practice you would advise?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that you said it so great. I really like the way that you framed it. Because yeah, I think, so one is that a lot of trauma survivors are used to, especially if it's something that maybe happened in childhood or it was like a bad relationship, like they're used to hiding it, right? Because part of the reason it's so traumatizing is that they didn't get any help or they weren't able to process it earlier. So they're used to hiding it. They're used to kind of maybe pretending that everything is okay. But yeah, it comes out in these ways, right? We lash out or maybe we shut down or whatever. And sharing it, at least with the folks in your life that, you trust and that you have a good relationship with, it helps break that silence, which is really important, right? So it helps to minimize some of that shame that people experience. But yeah, B, it also helps build that connection with your partner. So you can be like, right, exactly like you said, like, this is what's up, right? I'm working on it. I'm not trying to do this. I'm not trying to hurt you. Like, I'm not trying to be a crazy person, but like, I'm struggling right now, right? And I want you to know why that is. And yeah, if you give me some grace and like, I might need your help sometimes, that helps people in their life understand them better. It allows for more empathy because we can be like, oh, okay, so it's not just that you're being a jerk for no reason, right? You're getting triggered maybe, and there's something happening here. And is there maybe something that I need to do differently to support you in this, or just show up a little bit differently, or know that, for example, seeing your family is going to be really hard. And so like, we're going to plan for that together or something like that. Yeah, I generally advise that for folks because, like, it's going to come up. Like, no matter how hard you, like, try and, like, contain it, if you get to know someone well enough, like, eventually something's going to happen. You're going to lash out. You're going to get upset. And, like, it's healthier if we can build our relationships based on, like, truth and honesty, than, like, trying to pretend that we're someone that we're not. Now, of course, right, I'm not saying you have to tell everybody like all the gory details, right? There may be things that you don't feel comfortable sharing, but you can still say like, hey, I had some like terrible things happen to me when I was a kid and I'm working through it without having to always get into all the details, Yeah.
And I would say too that strikes me as such I've done it a bit myself and I know the bravery it took me. Yeah. It's such a courageous thing to do to go to people you love and say, I understand that I have this thing, this pattern, this behavior, this response, whatever. And I know that it's there and I'm figuring it out and I don't know when I'm going to be able to have figured it out enough to wrangle it in all the time, but I know it's there and I'm working on it. It takes so much more courage in my mind to do that than to do the alternative, which is sort of like the pretending it's not there and muscling your way through it and determination and like, that sort of thing. And just, I kind of believe that all emotions express themselves, whether you want them to or not, whether the only choice you really have is, are you creating a pathway to express it in a way that's healthy or generative or whatever, in a way that you're controlling the expression, or is it going to express itself against your will? Because it's coming out one way or the other.
Right? Exactly. Absolutely. It is always going to come out, right? It doesn't matter how. So yeah, we can prepare for it, or we can just wait and then it just shows up without our knowledge or without our consent. And that makes things even harder.
Yeah. You brought up something when you were kind of laying out what trauma is to you that I want to get back to, because I've been thinking about this a lot lately. I grew up in around Nashville, Tennessee, and one of the really, really formative experiences of my life was around early high school. I started doing theater, and it was really the first time I felt like I found community. Up to that point in my life, I was a pretty typical Southern kid. I had a pretty near-death experience thing happen when I was 9 that changed me. But that changed me more from being a very extroverted kid to like an introverted kid. But I was still, just an introverted kid by this point, reading a lot, struggling to find friend groups. And then when I started doing theater, all that stuff changed. And one of the reasons it changed was I was very, very lucky to meet a group of adults who kind of like cared for my development in a way that I hadn't really not to say anything about my family. I have a great family, but I'm just very different from them. So they didn't really know what to do with me. And so one of these adults was a hairdresser in the town I grew up in. He was back then, this would have been like 2000, around 2000. He was, openly gay, huge personality, one of the kindest, most beautiful people I've ever known. And he would take us out to like go see theater. And when we were old enough, go to this club that he loved called Play in Nashville. It's still there. Shout out to Play in Nashville, to see drag shows. And so I was very, very lucky in this formative period of my life, considering where I came from. I was very lucky to be exposed to and find a lot of friends within, queer communities, queer spaces, drag performances, all this stuff. And this all really expanded my worldview in a way that I had not had up to that point. I still have a ton of friends, and I'm still working in an art space, and, a ton of my friends who are in that art space are in those communities and other, communities that are very vocally expressing that they feel kind of attacked right now. This brings to mind something you said about trauma, which is that the first step is to find some sort of relative safety. What if you're experiencing trauma, cultural trauma, social trauma, political trauma, things that are being done to you and the groups that you identify with, parts of your identity that you identify with, that you can't escape? How are you supposed to integrate, and understand that trauma and work through it if you can't find safety?
Yeah. Oof, that is a really great and unfortunately very relevant question, right? For a lot of people in the United States right now, especially members of the queer community. So I want to acknowledge that some of that we can't right now, right? And some of it right now is knowing that you might be in a place of struggle, of anxiety, of some fear, and no therapy in the world is going to, I can't undo that, right? I can't change policies. If you're somewhere where you're feeling threatened, that's real. And I want to validate that. And I think that's also really important. I think that's a really important thing for a therapist to do, is to validate reality. And I think it's really important to have people in your life who are validating your reality, right? So whether that's friends, family, your community, to have people that you can go to, right? So we're reversing it a little bit, but finding that community first can be really helpful, and just be like, yeah, we're also feeling freaked out and scared, right? So you don't feel alone, right? You know that your version of reality is getting validated, that you're not crazy, that you are seeing things clearly. Because I think when we think about trauma, a lot of times what happens is that when I talk to folks, right, who've experienced trauma, regardless if it was as a child, an adult, whenever, what often makes that trauma harder is not just the thing that happened, the events. It's then feeling like they're alone, right? Because there's an element of, when I talk about this idea of like overwhelming our ability to cope, there's a sense of powerlessness there, right? That we can't do anything about it. We're kind of stuck, right? For whatever reason, we're stuck in it. And that can mean that personally we feel stuck, or that we feel stuck because there's nobody around us who supports us or believes us or can help us. And so we just wind up feeling alone. And so when we're young, we really can even as adults, but especially as kids, we can really internalize that. But even as adults, we can internalize and be like, well, I guess it's me, or I guess I'm the problem, right? And so I would say for folks who are currently experiencing harm, trauma, fear, finding community, finding people who believe you, finding spaces where you feel supported, but then finding spaces where you feel that there is something that you can do is really important, right? You don't necessarily have to like save the world, but is there something that you can do at your community level, right? So I'm located in New York, and I know this has happened in a lot of places, but during COVID, a lot of mutual aid groups sort of sprung up, right, to help folks get access to, masks and food and healthcare. And a lot of them still exist, right? My local one is, celebrating its 5-year anniversary. And so that can be a way to feel connected to your community, right? Getting involved with like a local group and making sure that people have access to food, or that people have access to financial supports, or that people have access to drag shows, right? Whatever it is that's going to be meaningful for your community. Is it going to fix this larger trauma? No. But at least it's going to remind you that you have agency and power in some areas of your life. And that helps give us the support and the confidence and the resiliency to keep moving forward, even when there are certain things that we can't necessarily change, right? But reminding ourselves that there are things we still hopefully have some control and some power over is really, really important, right? But then also finding having a therapist or finding restorative spaces and finding ways to express your feelings, whether that's through art or, screaming with your friends or, going to a really good dance class. We got to find ways also get out some of this stress and shit that builds up on us, so that we're not completely overwhelmed and that, we're taking care of ourselves. It's a hard moment.
If you are enjoying this episode of Beyond the Walled Garden, there's something I would really, really appreciate it if you would do. Interact, engage with it in whatever capacity you choose on whatever platform you happen to be on. If you're on YouTube, you can subscribe, you can you can leave a comment. If you're on a podcast platform, you can rate this episode, rate the podcast. And if you're feeling particularly supportive, you can share this episode with your friends and family. Any combination of these things is going to help more people learn about the show. And as this show is explicitly aimed at helping its audience, I think the more people, the better. Even if you don't want to do any of that, I really appreciate you checking out this episode. Back to the interview. It sounds like too, if you're someone who's maybe not necessarily in those communities, but you have friends or loved ones or people who you want to support. It seems like listening and being there and maybe being the one that screams with them and being the one who goes out dancing with them to get some of that energy out is going to be really, really important right now. Okay, so let's jump into liberation now. Tell me what you mean by liberation.
Great. Liberation. I think it's such a great idea. It kind of originated in, I want to say the 70s or 80s in South America, when folks were doing work with people who were experiencing trauma as a result of, dictatorships and political upheaval, right? And the idea was that historically, right, psychology therapy has been very internally focused, right? Very much what's happening inside of you. And maybe, we talk about your family a little bit, but it's still very kind of this micro level, right? And so liberation was okay, we actually have to expand because we have to understand the ways that oppressive systems are impacting folks and are, maybe creating trauma or constricting our opportunity to express ourselves or connect with ourselves or whatever is happening, right? And so when we're talking about, liberation, the way that I'm conceptualizing it is we absolutely have to think about systems, right? That are both oppressive, but also liberatory potentially, right? But we all operate within systems, right? So whether that is, you right now and the positionality that you find yourself in, right? Race, gender, where you're living, all of these things, but also what about your family? Right? Where's your family coming from? What's that cultural history? What's that context there? Right? I have family on one side who were, all immigrants from Poland at the turn of the century, right? So what does that mean in terms of, their economic status and what was it like to move to another country and learn another language and how did that influence the way that they interacted with the world? So those things are really important, right? And I always try and bring that in with clients, when we're talking about what's showing up for them. I work with a lot of women, unsurprisingly, and men. But so if I'm working with women, sometimes we'll talk about are you encountering some sexism in the workplace? right? Like if we're noticing a pattern of like, wow, I always feel really bad when I talk to these male coworkers. Well, like maybe there's something going on there, right? That's related to these larger patterns of sexism. When I work with men, a lot of times we're talking about things like, well, you know, masculinity really impacts our ability to like connect to our emotions, right? Form healthy relationships, feel comfortable expressing, you know, our creative and artistic sides, all of that. Like, we got to talk about that stuff, right? It's not just you. It's not just something's wrong with you, but you're operating in a culture and a society that's also doing things to you, right? And then when we're thinking about liberation is like, okay, so then what? Where do we have access? Where do we have power to make some changes, right? Is that through, if we can recognize these systems, are there active things that we can do to like counter them? Is it just we need to recognize that and say like, okay, so that's the system I'm working under, right? And like, I know that it's not just my fault, and I need to focus on the things that I can do, that I can change, right, in my life. So I think you need both. I think you need to understand how systems impact you, and then you have to look for the ways that you can make change or have some agency in your life. And because it's not just about victimhood and just sort of like keeping people in like, well, you're oppressed and that's just where you are forever. It's like, yeah, you've had oppression or you've had this happen to you and that sucks and I'm really sorry. And what do we do next? Within the confines of our reality, right? Because again, like sometimes there are things like, you know, we live in like a capitalist system, and if you live in the United States, like you probably have to work. You know, you probably have to work for an income. Very few of us have the luxury of, you know, an inheritance. But within that confine, can we find a job maybe that feels less exploitative, right? That feels more supportive, that feels, you know, like it's serving you and isn't oppressing you, right? So navigating those pieces. So that's kind of how I'm framing liberation, my own interpretation of it. If you're interested, look up liberation psychology and you can read the whole actual formal philosophy behind it.
It's great. That was a great answer. Something that jumped out to me there was victimhood. You know, victimhood is a complicated thing because I mean, I know a lot of people who I would say are victims of systems, but they resist seeing themselves that way enough even to kind of like, it seems like when you accept, tell me if I'm wrong, but it seems like when you accept for a moment that you might be a victim of some system, what it does is it distances you from that system and it puts some amount of space between you so that you can start looking at it and you and the ways in which those things interact. And it seems like there are so many people who just don't want to do that, because if they put the distance between themselves and the system and they start to look at it critically, you know, maybe they've internalized some of the values of the system, and it would irrevocably change their perspective on themselves, and they don't want to engage in that process. How do you help people get through this victimhood like challenge? Because, you know, if you're unwilling to accept that you might be a victim of these systems, then it seems like it would be really hard to analyze those systems, no?
Yes, that is a really great way to frame it. And I think it's true both for systems and then also for these maybe sort of individual level traumas that we experience, right? Because I also encounter that with folks when we're talking about, let's say, your family. A lot of people are like, oh, what trauma, right? I don't know what you're talking about. Like, you know, but to your point, all that does is it centers the problem in you, the person, right? You, the client, like there's something wrong with you, right? So if you're struggling, you're having a hard time, it's not your family, it's not the system, it's you, you're broken, we need to fix you, right? And so if we can build that like separation, right? And stop seeing it as like, oh, it's just that you're broken, but that you're responding to these like other things that have happened, right? To your point, then we get to see like, oh, wait, maybe I didn't do something wrong. Maybe this thing happened to me. Someone did this thing to me. And so instead of focusing on how to fix myself to be less broken, I have to figure out how to like navigate differently, maybe through the world, right? Or have a different relationship to these things. And so I have certain values, beliefs, opinions. but at the same time, it's not my job to give you a lecture. That wouldn't be very helpful. What I try to do with folks is be curious, offer challenges, you know. I think it's interesting that you said that. Well, where's that coming from, right? This idea, you know, that you have to be a certain degree of successful. Well, says who? What do you think about that? How do you feel about that, right? Because I think, to your point, a lot of us don't necessarily think that critically or curiously about our world, our experience, what we've been through. And so having the space to think about it, even if you don't know, or you're like, it's fine. Having that space can allow you to reflect and say, like, oh, maybe there is more going on here, right? Maybe this isn't working for me. I've had some clients who are, you know, have said, like, you know, like, I've really learned a lot about, like, the patriarchy from working with you. And I'm not necessarily, like, again, lecturing them about it, but I am asking questions like, it seems like a lot of the guys that you're interacting with treat you in this kind of way. What's that like, right? Or, like, where did you learn this about relationships? You know, like,
yeah,
do you like that? Is that working for you? And then people can sort of be like, oh, maybe it's not. Or even to have a therapist express, like, surprise, right? Of like, wow, that doesn't seem great. People start to think differently sometimes, and they're like, wait, you have a different thought about that? You don't think that's necessarily okay? No, I don't necessarily think that's okay. What do you think about that? Because to your point earlier, when you're talking about being in school, like, so many of us, so often, right, we just kind of, like, go from thing to thing to thing and stay in a worldview that isn't challenged, or we don't let it be challenged. And when our therapist challenges it, even if you don't agree with me, at least you're being curious about it. And you might be like, oh, maybe there's another perspective that's out there, and maybe I could, like, look into this or think about it. So that's always, you know, I think that's always kind of, like, fun and interesting for me to challenge people. And I like to be challenged too, right? And again, it's not about pulling things away from folks, right? There are a lot of things that people, you know, engage in or believe or find support in that isn't necessarily for me. I'm not here to tell you, like, you know, don't go to church because I'm not religious, right? Tell me about church. Tell me about what that means for you, so we can understand better, like, is this something that you want, or is this something you just feel like you're supposed to do, right? That's what I'm just trying to get to. Not that you have to necessarily 100% agree with me.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that's a really comforting thing to know for anybody who's considering therapy or maybe intimidated by therapy. I know a lot of my family that I've tried to, like, you know, gently nudge towards maybe going to talk to someone. There's such an anxiety around it. And I think in my family anyway, it's mostly fear of judgment. But I wonder if the sort of, like, scale or pathway from therapy to awareness of the patriarchy is a thing, because that happened in mine too. I started doing therapy, and it was a few years before I started to really have this conversation, but I had female therapists, and then I had a male therapist who was an existential therapist, and I was just really, really lucky. This was in Oregon. It was, like, on a farm. There was just a bunch of therapists on this farm. It's great. Cool. If you happen to be around Portland, look it up. They do animal therapy, they do archery, they do, you know, walking and nature therapy, all sorts of stuff. And it's a bunch of different people there. And the one that I had was a male about my age. And he really helped me to discover the ways in which I had internalized the patriarchy, and was sort of like, mirroring or marrying the patriarchy with my version of masculinity and the discord that was causing in me. And, you know, he had experienced that too and shared some of his. So I wonder if that is the thing. Like, going to therapy helps you just see it.
I think so. But that's great. I'm glad you had that experience. And I think that's really important, though, this piece of judgment, right? Ideally, a good therapist is non-judgmental, right? It should provide a space that feels non-judgmental. Now, yes, we're humans. We have thoughts and feelings. I'm not going to like pretend that I'm some perfectly unbiased robot, right? But my job is to check those things so that I'm not bringing them into the session in a way that is putting my values on a client, right? It's my job to like hold a space, to be non-judgmental, to be curious and compassionate without judgment, right? And if you have a therapist that you feel like is really judging you or judging your behavior or judging your thoughts and actions, like that's probably not the therapist for you, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a good.
It's definitely a good thing to know. I mean, I don't think I've ever really felt judged in therapy. Not really. I've been afraid that I was being judged, but on further, examination, I wouldn't say that I was ever really judged in a way that I would say like my family's afraid of being judged, as if their value as people is somehow being like critiqued. So we have these three. Let's talk about the intersection of neurodiversity, trauma, and liberation. What do you mean when you talk about the intersection of those three things?
It's a great question. Okay, so I think with all of these concepts is number one is really about valuing and respecting individuals, respecting the ways in which they have tried to survive and tried to function, oftentimes in situations or systems that were harmful or unsupportive, right? So when we think about neurodivergence, unfortunately, I mean, things are changing. We're getting more education. There's more advocacy. But unfortunately, historically, a lot of folks grow up in settings where they've gotten really, whether they were diagnosed or not, they've gotten a lot of like shame and blame and punishment for the ways in which they act and move and think. So that's created harm, right? Which itself can be really traumatizing. So a lot of times there's a lot of overlap between folks who are neurodivergent and folks who've experienced trauma. So we have those sort of intersections. And then from this liberation perspective is also then seeing like how all of this is interconnected with these systems, right, that maintain a certain idea of what it means to be a person, right? So to your idea, like in the US in 2025, right, it means upholding certain values around masculinity and femininity. It means certain values around family and relationships, particularly sort of this heteronormativity, right? Certain values around work and productivity, certain values even around, religion and spirituality and belief systems, right? And so anyone who is challenging that or is finding that those systems are unworkable for them or are harming them, that creates trauma. It's really challenging, especially for neurodivergent folks who, for various reasons, don't fit into those systems, no matter how hard they try. And so they're all about how do we break free? How do we push back against systems and people that are harming us and connect more deeply with ourselves and our own power and our own agency, which I think all of these things are about, right? I mean, healing from trauma is all about connecting to your agency, right? A lot of times with neurodivergence, it's about that as well. It's saying like, yeah, the way that you think about the world and move through the world, it's not wrong. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just, what do you actually need to be successful, right? And from that liberatory perspective, it's like, yeah, maybe you're someone who has been harmed by systems. So then what can you do about it? Or how can you create a life that still has meaning and purpose for you, despite what this is doing to you? So I think all of these approaches is about helping folks rediscover their humanity and connect with other humans, right? So that we can hopefully create a more compassionate, inclusive, understanding society, which is what I would love, right? Again, it's not about judgment, but it's, can we build some compassion? Can we build some acceptance for all the ways in which we are different? You know, can we build some acceptance and understanding for the ways in which we've all been traumatized by so many experiences, right? And so those folks who lash out or are struggling with substance abuse or are struggling with mental illness, can we have some compassion for the ways in which maybe their trauma and their experiences has impacted them and they need help now? Right? That's what I think it's all about, is having that kindness and compassion for others and for ourselves.
That's a beautiful thing to help people discover in themselves and in the world. I'm wondering, you know, what about people who can't afford to engage in a long process like therapy? You know, if they are, I mean, I personally know a bunch of people who the resources aren't there, either financially or time. I mean, you know, single moms with like 3 kids and 50-hour work weeks, like time for therapy. What is that? So how do you advise people sort of like find this liberation and this connection with agency? I love that phrase. If they can't jump into a therapeutic practice.
I think that's a great question. And I want to really validate that. And we could go on a whole conversation about the challenges of our current mental health system. But yeah, you're right. For a lot of people, therapy and like good quality therapy is financially inaccessible or logistically or practically inaccessible. I will say a positive that has come out of the last few years is the move to telehealth. So even though I do see some clients in person, I see a lot of folks virtually. And so that expands the reach. Even though I'm based in the city, I have folks I work with who live out of the city, which is great. So I will put that out there that like if you're living in a state, you have access to the internet, a lot of times you can just look for anybody who's licensed in your state, and that broadens the opportunities. And that can be helpful. But if it's not for you, or, you know, also it's not something that people are interested in, and it takes a lot of work. Even if you have the money and the time, like finding a therapist that you like and that you feel like is understands you and is supportive and is the person that, like, that's hard. And sometimes it takes a few tries and people are like, I don't want to keep doing this, which I totally understand, right? So I think a lot of it comes back to a lot of things that we've been talking about, right? So like, number one, obviously community, right? So having people in your life who are loving and supportive and compassionate, whether those are partners, friends, family, just a volunteer community that you belong to. But having that community is really important because it can help us helps us feel more understood. It helps us feel validated. If it can give us a sense of meaning and purpose. So any way that you can find that community is really important, especially now, right? As we're all so separated and, you know, living in these virtual spaces and everything. It's really important to find that if you can. I think it can be really, you know, developing some practice of self-compassion, which is hard, right? It could be an affirmation, which some people find helpful. It can be meditation. It can just be, sometimes I just like have to tell people, like, just kind of catch yourself when you are saying things or engaging in behaviors that are really like self-harming or like unkind, you know, and learning if you can to like shift that, you know, like trying to validate and be like, okay, this is a trauma response, or, you know, maybe there's something wrong with me, or the way, like, if we can shift away from like, there's something wrong with me, that's okay. Just try that, everyone. Like, try and shift away from like, there's something inherently wrong with me, and see how that feels. The great thing is there's a lot of resources, there's a lot of books, there's a lot of podcasts and websites. So if you're interested in learning about all of this, there's a lot that you can do. I am blanking on the author's name, but The Myth of Normal, Gabor Mate. He's a psychiatrist, a researcher. So he talks a lot about this, talks a lot about trauma and you know, how trauma is this kind of wound that we are all trying to heal from. So learning about that. There's a lot of stuff out there about neurodiversity. If you're interested, a lot of folks who are writing about it now. You can learn more about that. So I think learning from folks who are in the field, if you can't go to therapy, but at least having some like understanding of it can help us with some of that shame and blame and stuff that we tend to absorb. And finding the things that bring you joy. It's really, really, really important, especially in a society where it can be really hard to find the time, or we're incentivized to like monetize the things that like bring out our hobbies, you know, where it's right. Like you said, we're working 50 hours a week and you got these kids. Like, can you take your kids to the playground for an hour, right? Can we find half an hour to like read a book, make a watercolor painting, you know, go to the museum, find the things that bring you joy, no matter how weird or offbeat they might be. Again, as long as you're not hurting anyone, you need that too, because that connects you to yourself, that connects you to other people. And especially in a society that increasingly seems to not value joy and creativity and art, I think finding those spaces for yourself becomes increasingly more important, because we need joy. It's the reason that we keep moving forward. Yeah.
Wow. What a great set of piece of advice there. I think too, like, you know, just to piggyback off of that, doing things for their own sake because they bring you joy is like in and of itself liberating in this, you know, we're talking American society. In this society, that is liberating, because if you're not trying to monetize it and you're not feeding any sort of system with it other than your own internal well-being, that is an act of resistance, you know? So I think that's a really great perspective to have. I mean, something too I would throw out there, when I started, I was in therapy for a few years before it really started to, before I was in a place, I'll frame it that way because I think that's closer to the truth, before I was in a place to really examine what was going on in me. It took me a while in therapy to even get up to that place. I just knew I needed to talk to someone, and that lasted years before I was actually ready to change or to start doing work. And something that I remember very vividly, because I was journaling about it at the time, that was big for me was to approach it from a perspective of being curious, not necessarily, and letting that curiosity lead the way. I mean, you've already discussed 2 books here that, you know, there was a version of me that would have listened to the books that you recommended and then started to immediately like identify with that and say, okay, what's my trauma? How do I need to work through my trauma? And that actually got to be kind of overwhelming to me. Mm-hmm. But what was more approachable was saying, yeah, what is trauma? And disconnect it from me and just say, as an act of discovery, I'm just going to explore this. And that I think took some of the pressure off in a strange way. And it let me kind of like internalize these ideas as sort of things that were floating around in my head. And then I could pull from them in a way that wasn't so overwhelming. So I would just offer that to anyone who's watching or listening, as well as something that was personally helpful. I think we've arrived at this point, at the big question. This question must be asked. It is the mandate of the show. This question must be asked at some point in the show, and now it is our time. The question is, this show is aimed at helping people break out of what I classify as a binary, mechanistic, black and white, capitalistic, derivative modernity. Boring, bland, bifurcated, segmented, blah. And the way that I'm trying to help people do that is to offer different perspectives, different ideas, different ways of being that challenge, all of the forces that are trying to reify and convince us of that of that version of modernity's existence and prevalence. I think most of this conversation has offered a ton of alternatives to that reality. But I'm curious, are there any ideas or philosophies or schools of thought or practices that you think of where it's like, man, that is something that when I integrated it, or I saw the people I'm working with integrate it, it really did sort of recontextualize their worldview in a way that helped them see themselves as more fully human?
I love that question. That's so, what a great question. So I certainly think the sort of paradigm of neurodiversity, right? So this idea that neurodiversity is just something that is normal and natural, and we need to learn to adapt and accommodate instead of trying to fix is really important. There's a book, another book, Neuroqueer Heresies. I forget the author's name, but it's a great book because it really talks about this idea. It really kind of challenges this idea of like, okay, so like, what if you were just your like full self, right, in places, right? What if you did allow yourself to like stim a little bit, right? A lot of neurodivergent folks, like we like to stim, right? We fidget, we move our bodies around. Like, what if you just did that, right? Again, as long as we're not like super disruptive, but like, what if you did allow yourself to like get up and walk around, you know, during a meeting or something like that? I do that. Like sometimes I like rock in my chair back and forth when I'm with clients or I have a stim because I'm like, that's what I need. And why not model it to folks that that's okay, right? I'm doing that right now. And that's really helpful to normalize that, to be like, what if you just did that? What if you just, to use the phrasing, unmasked a bit, right? In places that are safe, right? I also think it's important to put out there, like, we do still live in a society that is all those things that you mentioned, right? Dualistic and mechanistic. And unfortunately, there's not always going to be spaces where it feels safe to be that full version of ourselves, right? And we need to sometimes be thoughtful about that. But what if we were able to do that, at least in like the places that we felt safer with, the friends, the family, the communities where it felt okay? What would that feel like, right? So I think that's one, is allowing ourselves to be our full selves and not seeing that as a problem, and allowing ourselves to talk for half an hour about our special interest, because hopefully other people will also find it interesting. So that's one piece of it. Something else, in terms of philosophy, or I think, we were talking about this earlier, but I really, really think it's true. And I've really seen that it's important for my clients, but also for myself as a person in the world, is that importance of connection and honesty with the people in your lives, right? So many of us are so afraid to tell people what we're struggling with, what our feelings are. We don't want to upset them. We don't want to be a burden. Wherever we learn this, right? There's some epidemic, it feels like sometimes in this country, that like we all have to keep all of our stuff locked up inside, and you can't ever tell anybody else that you're struggling, because like then you're burden them with your pain, and they won't want to deal with it. So you got to like learn not to bother them. And encouraging clients to like, first of all, therapy is a good place to try that, right? You go and you talk to a stranger and you tell them all your stuff, and they care and they're interested, and you're like, oh, maybe other people might care. But I really always try and challenge folks, like, well, what if you told your partner? What if you told your mom? What if you told your best friend that this was going on? What do you think they'd do? How do you think they would respond? People who take that risk, like you said, it's hard. It takes a lot of bravery. People who take that risk to be honest, like, right? We have stronger relationships. We feel more connected. We feel less alone. We feel like when we're going insane, that there's somebody there who gets it, and like, okay, I can go a little bit crazy and this person is still going to be there for me. So that, I don't know if it's a formal philosophy so much as it's a challenge to this. It's this idea of interdependence. That's what I want to say. I think so often we've problematized this idea of like codependency, right? How many of us have heard that, right? Oh, I'm codependent. And it becomes really problematized, and it really becomes this idea again of like, well, you have to figure out your stuff before you can ever think of having relationships with other people. And like, that is crazy. Humans are forms of community, you know, like babies need parents, they need caregivers. Like a baby can't figure things out on their own. And so this idea that like we're all supposed to just individually in our own little pockets figure our shit out before we can bother having relationships or friendships, to me is nuts. Because yes, therapy can help, but therapy is just like a tiny fraction out of your whole life. You have to take those things and then practice them in the real world with the people you care about, right? And so we have to shift away from like codependency in the most sort of problematic way is where, you know, we really can't kind of function on our own, right? We really feel like I need this other person to like take care of me all of the time and I can't do anything ever. And unless, you know, I'm not talking about disability, like that's its own thing. I'm talking about like if we feel like emotionally we can't handle our own shit. Sure, that's something we maybe need to work on. But it's equally problematic when we are way too independent and don't need anybody for anything. So interdependence, I'm going to say, that's the idea. That's the philosophy of like, how can we like rely on each other, communicate with each other, get support from each other, and find that helpful and healing in its own right. Because I think that is also a challenge to our current society, which tends to keep us very siloed.
Yeah, I love this idea of interdependence and independence. I love it. I think it really hits the nail on the head in terms of like the pressures that are facing a lot of us. I mean, my brain just kind of like wanders over the landscape of American figureheads of independence that are like, you know, supposedly shown to us as like, you know, models, ways we should be, people we should model after. And if you examine any of them for even more than a few moments, you'll realize that they were pretty interdependent, most of these people.
Yes.
And the ones that weren't didn't seem to be very happy. I mean, or it was a manufactured image or something that was, you know, cultivated to suit a specific end. So I think interdependence and independence are like two things I'm definitely going to be thinking about a lot. And I really appreciate you offering that. I can't really think of a better place to end the conversation. I mean, that's such a great place to wrap it up. So could you just please give us a little bit of information about what you're up to, where you want people to find more information about you, where you like to be found on the internet if people want to reach out to you and talk further?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So you can find me on my website, which is saraeldridgelcsw.com. So that's SARAELDRIDGE LCSW.com. It has some more information about me. It has an email that you can use if you want to get in touch with me. I'm happy to chat with folks. Currently, right now, I work at a practice called Liberation-Based Therapy, which is where I'm offering therapy. So if you're based in New York and you're looking for therapy, go to our website, liberationbasedtherapy.com. Myself, we have a lot of really, really great, thoughtful, caring therapists out there. And we take a lot of insurance, which is very cool. So you can do that. But yeah, I'm always happy to chat. I give presentations and workshops, and I'm always happy if you want me to come talk to anyone about trauma, neurodivergence, mental health. I can do that. And I'm located in New York. So if you are also in the city and want to say hi, you can reach out to me and we can chat.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, Sara. It was a real pleasure talking to you. I appreciate it a lot.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks for checking out this episode of Beyond the Walled Garden. I have been Joel Austin. Please, if you enjoyed it, let me know that you enjoyed it by rating the show, subscribing, liking, commenting, whatever the platform that you're on allows. That would be fantastic. You can find out more about Beyond the Walled Garden, me, Joel Austin, its host, or today's guest, Sara Eldridge, via the show notes or description. Please do check that out, as this one is going to be especially link heavy. If you found the books that Sara recommends particularly interesting, there are links for you to go directly to those books. I've got a link down there for you to check out personality assessments so you can discover your own meaning. There's a bunch of cool stuff in there, so please do check it out. Thanks again for joining me on this episode, and I will see you beyond the walled garden.